From TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jason Kitamura, and this is Tech in Cannabis. I talk with game changers in the tech community to gain valuable insights into the future of the fast-paced cannabis industry. Today, we are joined by Cy Scott, CEO and co-founder of Headset.io. We talk about how he began as a software developer and created a little platform called Leafly to help people choose the right strain of cannabis, and how he transformed that into what it is today. We also talk about Headset and how treating cannabis like a consumer packaged good is positively changing the outlook of the industry and its data collection. Finally, Cy gives us a very valuable insider's look into the future of cannabis based on current trends in the market. All right, so today we have CEO and co-founder of Headset, Cy Scott. Hi, Cy. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me.
So you out there that don't know who Cy is, he's also the co-founder of Leafly, which I know all of you know what Leafly is. So, before we get started into Headset, I wanted to kind of touch on your background with Leafly. I did a little digging. It looked like, were you a software developer by trade when you first were getting started?
Yeah, definitely. So, computer science major, coming out of college, really fell into the startup scene. Prior to Leafly, had a couple small companies, not nearly as successful. Nothing in the cannabis space. Leafly was my first foray into cannabis, but really focused more on mobile at the time. This was the mobile in the days of pre-iPhone, for those old enough to remember what that was like. We used to do a lot of different app development, game development, things like that. So, right out of school, right into startups, mostly followed that path. Had kind of a detour at one point, actually working at Kelly Blue Book, which is a more traditional
Mhm.
technology firm. For those that are familiar, car valuation service, KBB.com, and that was really nice for me to get a little experience at kind of a more traditional organization and kind of see what some scale looks like. Because prior to that, with startups, they're often small teams, in the beginning. So, did that, but was just desperate to kind of get back into the startup scene. And that really was a big driver for, pursuing Leafly. Um, and all sorts of other trends that we were seeing at the time that really made sense to just start that service.
Now, when you first started Leafly, were you like one of the developers building the product also?
Yeah. So I'm one of three founders of Leafly. So myself, Scott Vickers, and Brian Wanselich, and we started it back in 2010. We actually were all at KBB at the time. Scott and I went to college together, and that's how we had known each other. And we'd done some projects in the past, but we met Brian at KBB, and Brian really kind of brought us into the world of dispensaries, which at 2010 was still pretty early on. I mean, dispensaries in California have been around since the 90s, but the kind of the state of the dispensary proliferation, there were just so many popping up. For those that are in California, that can remember what that looks like, I think you could see kind of how Leafly started. Similar company, Weed Maps, kind of about the same time, starting really just to kind of solve similar problems, although different approaches. Um, but Scott and I, went to school together, so both computer science majors, so both also developers, so we had that ability. In my kind of professional career, not only was I building things, but I kind of moved more into traditional product management, which is less hands-on building, but more about product vision and alignment and making sure what's getting built fits kind of organizational strategy and so on. But certainly could code. And so that was a great way to start, and with Scott as well. And then Brian has a design background, and so when we started Leafly, we got a lot of attention because of our approach. So cannabis in 2010 was very much the stoner stereotype still. Most outlets that existed, were the high times of the world. There were a few forums that were out there, but nothing really spoke to kind of a mainstream audience. And when we started Leafly, one of the things that I said was, if we're going to build a site around cannabis, and let's build something that we would like to use, that would speak to us as kind of a more traditional mainstream consumer. Thinking about cannabis as something maybe we enjoy, but not something that defines our lifestyle, which is so much of the high times kind of world. And total respect to that, but the cannabis consumer it's such a wide net. There's the soccer moms all the way to the everyday consumer. And we wanted to create a platform to do that. So Brian brought some great design abilities, and Scott and I could build, and I had a product sensibility. And with the three of us, it's enough to get something off the ground. And in 2010, It was still hard to launch websites, I would say. It's still a bit challenging to launch things that kind of that could scale pretty easily. Today, I think it's a bit easier to even get like a minimum viable product off the ground. There's lots of services you can build on top of, but
Right.
kind of having these complementary abilities at the time really helped us kind of get it off the ground and get some attention early on.
Now, aside from, I guess, seeing all the dispensaries popping up, was there any other motivation that kind of took you from kind of the mainstream business world into cannabis? That is kind of a big jump. And I guess at what point did you go full in to your cannabis business and kind of step away from everything else?
Yeah, yeah. So it was bootstrapped, so we weren't pulling for some time. But yeah, the real impetus was around seeing kind of the proliferation of dispensaries and actually going to a dispensary for the first time. And back in 2010, it sounds sound like such an old timer here, but you'd go into you go into a dispensary and it would be a couple bud tenders and you'd have all these jars of flour that was strain branded, but you didn't know what farm it came from. You didn't know how it was tested. Frankly, you didn't even really know if it was the strain that was labeled at the time. It was just kind of unknown vendors that were providing this product. And you would talk to the bud tenders and ask, and they would just give you suggestions by saying, hey, people seem to like this, or this is a really popular strain right now. But that was kind of all the information that we could get. So Scott actually started tracking his consumption as he found that he liked certain strains more than others. Whatever it was he was looking for, he wanted to find patterns and gravitate more towards certain types. And so he started tracking it just personally, and we started talking about, well, why don't we build a platform where people can share this type of information and kind of do consumer reviews around the different strains, and then in aggregate, kind of get a good sense because when you're at the mercy of the bud tender, you never know, right? They may have different tastes
Right.
than you. Maybe they haven't, tried every strain, as much as I'm sure they would have liked
Right.
to do so. It can be quite overwhelming when you have, you know, 20, 30 different strains at a given dispensary. So that kind of seeing that problem out there and knowing, if we're having this problems and certainly others may have this problem, and then seeing just the number of dispensaries that were, popping up everywhere, we thought, well, there's something here. And then the mainstream consumer, really look to ourselves, again, something that from time to time kind of enjoy, just like I enjoy beer and wine from time to time, knowing that there's more people like us. And then, in dispensaries themselves, you'd go in and you'd see actual patients in dispensaries, people that were looking
Right.
for cannabis to help them with whatever medical condition they had. You'd see kind of recreational consumers as well, that were just, there to purchase cannabis. But we thought, this is a broad audience here, and really there's nothing that speaks to them. And so that was really the driver, and we started with this kind of periodic table of elements look, and a lot of that was driven by having to have a simple language for people to be able to navigate the different strains. We launched with like 100 strains. It's so funny now. I think there's almost 2,000 on Leafly, and there's probably certainly more than that are out there. But we started this periodic table of elements. We didn't really have photos, so we didn't really have a good way to classify them. And then, we use the sativa hybrid indica kind of methodology and kind of color coded. And you see a lot of the leafy colors out there still to this day, to help people understand and navigate that. And certainly cannabis is much more sophisticated than that, with things like terpene profiles and testing profiles. But at the time, though, in 2010, there really wasn't a lot of access to that kind of information. It was really, you go in a dispensary and they would categorize them as sativa indica hybrid. So we did the same thing. But I think having that, relatively simple language to talk about cannabis was pretty powerful for people at the time. And people are getting more acclimated to this idea of different strains and different effects from the different strains. And so just giving people that platform to contribute and to share that knowledge, I think was a pretty powerful thing.
Well, there's definitely millions of people who have benefited from using your platform. Now, did you guys anticipate it getting so big when you were first putting it together?
I think with any startup, you hope,
Right.
but anybody with startup experience knows that it's quite challenging. Startups are very fragile, and it's really hard to get kind of scale. We you'd ask me kind of like, when do we jump in full from our like traditional tech? That was another thing. It was impossible to. We just didn't have the kind of scale. We wanted to, certainly. And we had great metrics, I think, for a traditional tech startup. I think that you kind of look at where we were in our life cycle to the type of traffic that we were getting on Leafly. Any sort of angel investor probably today it would be a no-brainer to invest. But back in 2010, into 2011, when we started having those conversations, a lot of the feedback from investors was, we get what you're doing. We really like what you're doing. These numbers look great, but we don't know if this is a thing that's going to go beyond California. There were a few other medical markets at the time, like Colorado and others, but really thinking about, when you look for investment, it's all about scale. It's all about how big can you get. If people are going to put, money behind you, can they get a 10x return on that money in a pretty rapid manner? And it was a hard thing to argue against. And in California, back in 2010, we tried to legalize adult use cannabis and it failed. And so that was another kind of signal. We were like, were we wrong? Was this not something that's going to be, sustainable, kind of a long-term industry? But we believed in it. And history shows, like with all the progress that's been made. I mean, it's stunning to see, how far we've come since then. But that was a challenge. That was a really hard thing for us to be able to go into it full time. So it wasn't until much later when we were able to kind of make the jump. And prior to making the jump, it's 2010. You tell people like, I'm in the cannabis industry, but we don't touch the plants. We're not growers. We're not making products. We're a data company. We provide people a platform to share their information, and a lot of caveats with how we talked about being involved. And I think everyone got it, but it was you kind of not make excuses, but you qualify it quite significantly in 2010. And now, if I tell anybody, it's like, well, how do I get involved?
Right.
Like, I want to be in this
Yeah.
industry. It's growing so quickly. Like, can I jump in now? Like, what's the best way to get in? It's night and day, and just in 10 short years.
Now, at one point in your kind of progress of building Leafly, did it come to the point where like, whoa, we really have something big here? Like, when did that happen?
Yeah, I think it was. When we started getting a number of reviews coming in and we started listing dispensaries on the service. So with Leafly, we started with strains and letting people review these strains. And that was the extent of it in the beginning. And we always wanted to connect people from the strains to the actual dispensaries where they could find those strains at the time. And once we started doing that and seeing kind of traffic build there, and then turning the dispensaries into clients of ours, where they would be paying us to be listed on there. That was kind of the moment where we're like, we have a business model, there's something here, and we can get moving. It was still hard to raise money though, even as we brought in, money, and it takes a lot when you have a traditional job in tech. You kind of have what they call golden handcuffs,
Right.
right? It just means like you're kind of stuck. You have a lifestyle, and you make a certain amount of money. You need to get to that kind of level, or you're sacrificing quite a bit, which you do with startups. But ultimately, we ended up with an exit with Privateer Holdings, who is now Tilray, which is a Canadian
Mhm.
LP, publicly traded. Tilray was a spin-out company from Privateer, and they had a similar vision at the time. Kind of cannabis is for a mainstream audience, and their mandate was to build, buy, and invest in organizations that were, kind of following that path. And Leafly was one of the only ones at the time that was doing that. And so we came together and stuck around with those guys for a number of years, kind of building Leafly up before we started Headset.
Gotcha. Now, from the popularity of Leafly, I mean, assuming you guys were able to gather an immense amount of data on cannabis. So is that the inspiration between the creation of Headset?
It was certainly a part of it. So, the Leafly data that we were gathering was really around the strains and how people were reviewing strains, the different effects, what are the popular strains that people are looking at. And that data is valuable, but it's only so valuable. I think there's a lot more to it, and that was kind of one of the things that was a motivator to start Headset. I guess it was really two factors. Customers at Leafly, cannabis brands were starting to emerge. So we went from a world where it was, this jars of flour, nondescript, you don't know where it comes from, to tested products, packaged goods, things like edibles and beverages and pre-rolls that come prepackaged, or even flour that's sourced, from a certain farm and tested a certain way. And these organizations were starting to become, brands unto themselves. And prior to that, it was really the strains were the brand. Blue Dream was kind of a brand, right? But now you're starting to look at, Blue Dream from a certain farm, or Blue Dream in an edible, what have you. And so those organizations started coming to us and saying, this is great, and there's all these emerging categories within cannabis, and we want to jump from flower into pre-rolls, or we want to move from pre-rolls into vapor pens and start to expand our business. And you guys at Leafly must know a lot about what the competitive landscape looks like and what types of brands are operating in that space, and what kind of sales projections can I expect if I start to produce a product there. And frankly, we really couldn't answer those questions. We could help them and say, well, look at these strains. These are popular strains if you're going to, invest in a new line of strains. But that was kind of the extent of it. So that was, one factor, kind of seeing those questions start to be asked, which is just a nice evolution of the industry. It was just a step forward kind of in the cannabis space. And then the other kind of impetus, or the other driver, was um, thinking about cannabis on a long enough time scale. Is going to be a consumer packaged goods industry like any other consumer packaged goods industry. And consumer packaged goods is really around, you think about beverage alcohol, or you think about grocery, these are, replenished items that people purchase frequently, generally relatively low price. Fast moving consumer goods is another term for that. And thinking about cannabis as a consumer goods industry, the consumer goods industry is powered by companies like Nielsen, companies like IRI, that provide this type of data, that source data from organizations like Walmart to really help organizations understand, when you're going to introduce a new, seltzer, alcoholic seltzer to the industry, how should you position it? What kind of sales can you expect? What is the risk of the wine industry or the beer industry on your seltzer? And cannabis didn't really have that. And we thought, these two factors, people starting to ask really smart questions, industry is maturing, knowing over the years ahead, it's only going to continue to mature, that there really needs to be, sophisticated data only play that can answer a lot of these questions for the industry.
Gotcha. I hear you talk about a lot about consumer packaged goods, and especially in some of your literature, you're very making the comparison, really trying to get people to realize that the cannabis industry is the same. I think your blog is even called like Cannabis Packaged Goods on Medium, correct? Is that true?
That's right. Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
so. I guess there's a lot of companies that are kind of popping up just because the business is doing well in the cannabis industry, and with that, data is always a big part of it. So I know some of the things that you guys do are a little bit different, where it looks like you really are trying to, get the data, but really like clean it, scrub it, get it right. You're using machine learning to kind of go through the data. You actually, on top of that, you actually have people like physical hands going through the data to validate and things like that. So I guess kind of just tell me about that process and why is it necessary?
Yeah, it's actually, quite complex. And in a world where we're surrounded by so much data, it almost it seems easier than it is. But you're absolutely right. It is a quite challenging problem. Um, I think, it was one of those things, you kind of jump into a new idea, and if you overthink it, like really analyze it, we're like, okay, well, when we started Headset, we did not think it would be this complicated, frankly. But it quickly, showed that it is, and it's complicated for a good reason. So yeah, all those things you said are accurate. So our data at Headset is sourced from our dispensary and retail cooperators. That's our primary source of data, and we get the data from them by integrating with their systems of record, which is tools like point of sale is a great system of record. If you imagine you're a retailer, a lot of your business is driven by your point of sale. And there's a lot of point of sale companies out there, companies like FlowHub and GreenBits and LeapLogix and a number of others. So we integrate with those point of sale providers, where we're able to hook in and pull a lot of information out of the point of sale, whether that's sales trends, inventory carry, even demographics data from loyalty programs. And we get all this great insight, and it's on a retail to retailer basis. So while we do the integration at the point of sale level, we have to work with each retail group independently and get permission to access their data in this way. And we give them a lot of services in exchange. So we give them what's considered business intelligence. So it's kind of analytics on their own data, so that they can really look at their data in unique ways and make it really easy, especially around retail metrics. There's very common retail metrics that are out there that retailers, whether you're talking about Walmart or Gap, or H&M, what have you, that look at certain retail metrics. And so we really wanted to bring those types of metrics to the cannabis industry to really help these operators, so they don't have to worry so much about the how they get the numbers. They just kind of get it delivered to them. So kind of like predictive in a way, like here's what you need to be doing when you're reordering. Here's some pro formas you can expect if you were to have this type of assortment when you open your store. Tools like that we give the retailers, and we also give them some benchmarking. So once we have enough data in a market, we tell them how they perform versus market averages, so they can say, well, if I'm underperforming this month, is it because the month is tough for everybody, or is it just me? And the opposite, right? If I'm doing really well, is it because the stores around me are also doing really well, or am I outperforming the market because of the types of improvements I'm making? So we also bring that to them, and we give them a lot of these services at no cost. We do have some premium services for retailers and dispensaries as well. And then in exchange, we're able to leverage that data in aggregate. So we don't, sell any of the retail data, but what we look at is the different products that they sell. And we look at it across a market like California. We say, this Kiva edible that's sold at all these stores in California, does this well. And so that's where the data kind of cleanup comes. So this normalization, data aggregation, product classification. There's a lot of terms for it.
Mhm.
Product coding. Basically, we have this database of products, of all the products that are sold in the cannabis industry, and we have to map what we see coming from the different retailers. And it's quite a sophisticated problem because every retailer is entering these products in different ways
Right.
in their point of sale. So, they don't have UPC. You see barcodes on products, but that's often, traceability, whether that's metric or some other
Mhm.
traceability service. And those barcodes are associated with batches, not necessarily with a product line. Like you would see in a grocery, you grab a bag of Doritos, there's a barcode. Every
Mhm.
grocery is scanning that barcode. You can match up the barcode relatively well. There's a lot of products that don't come barcoded in grocery, as an analogy, that you still have to code in different ways. But there are some advantages in kind of traditional categories. But for us, we look at a lot of text data. So we see, however that store, store A entered the product, and store B from a different chain may have that same product, but maybe they used an acronym for the brand, or they talked about the distributor, not
Right.
the brand name there. Maybe they misspell it when they type it in. So we have to do a lot of mapping. So we say, okay, these two products are actually the same product. And that's where a lot of the machine learning comes in for classification. Machine learning is a pretty powerful tool for classification. It's funny, when we started the headset in 2015, machine learning and deep learning networks, neural networks, were getting some good steam, like convolution neural nets, all this fancy stuff for like image classification. You look at two
Mhm.
pictures. Is that a picture of a hot dog or not a hot dog, for those that have seen Silicon Valley, right? And it's like you can do that classification. So we're doing the same kind of classification for products, leveraging a lot of that. And it's still very hard. And I think it's hard for other organizations that try to do. There are a few out there, um, services like Dutchy, like Jane, that do these online menus trying to do product classification, make it easy for the consumer to find a brand and then go and find that product at certain stores. Requires classification. So it's a tough problem. It's not only have the classification problem, but all these products are getting introduced constantly
Mhm.
to the market. And so you have to constantly keep that database updated. Every time you see something new on the store shelves, that needs to go into headset so we can map it and we can report on those sales. So it's a pretty sophisticated process just to get the data in a kind of a clean, usable format. And then we build a lot of analytics on top of it. So we can take it to the next level. And analytics is really, it's a fancy word for finding patterns in the data, right? So what type of patterns do we want people to see in the data? And so instead of just giving them the numbers and say, well, here's the sales, we can do a lot of analytics on the sales and say, well, it's selling this well because here's the price bands when you look at competitive sets and other products that are similar, and these are the price bands. So you can infer, maybe this does well because it's a lower price than these other brands. As one example,
Mhm.
we have all sorts of different analytics, whether it's basket analytics, where you can see co-purchase behavior when someone buys a certain brand, do they buy another brand at the same time? When a certain demographic generation, like a Generation Z, comes in and buys a pre-roll, what price point are they looking at? Do they throw anything in with that? And those are all analytics that we're able to provide on top of the data. So it gets very sophisticated. And that's where we have a lot of analysts on staff that are creating a lot of those reports. And a lot of it's driven from, our analysts' own insight into just the industry. And it's also driven from our customers that have very specific questions that they're trying to learn about the market. And it's, pretty easy to imagine if you put yourself in the shoes of you got a new license and you're able to come to market with, whether it's flower or pre-rolls or something like that, you're going to have a lot of questions about, how you're going to perform and who you're up against. And that's where, our market intelligence at Headset really comes in, with all those advanced analytics built on top of this layer of cleaned up data across, it's over 1,600 retailers on Headset right now that are providing this data and growing quickly. So it's a great set. We like to think that we have the best lens into how cannabis is sold out of any company out there. We see everything from the online transactions that come for those that are doing click and collect, like pre-order, to delivery, all the way to those that walk in the store. And not only that, but who is buying all that cannabis and how they're buying the cannabis. So we can answer a lot of great questions for the industry. And for me, it's a great being in it for 10 years. I saw a lot with Leafly, a lot of evolution, and now I get to see a lot of cool stories. And you mentioned the blog and like looking at CPG and looking at parallels. I mean, it's really about documenting all this exciting stuff that we're seeing. These are brands that are being developed today that could be around for decades. We
Yeah.
could be seeing them in mainstream retailers, before we die at some point. Who knows, right? Like what stores this stuff's going to be sold at. And I want to document those stories, and how they're leveraging kind of a traditional CPG playbook around product innovation and M&A type behavior and all sorts of things that traditional CPG has done a lot over the years. And how cannabis can leverage some of that, and also take advantage of a lot of things that are slowing down traditional CPG, like new consumers coming in that have different preferences, like Generation Z, the younger generation, doesn't like to buy the old brands, right? They're looking for new brands that might speak to them, and that's impacting, Lay's potato chips as it's getting more competitive. But in our space, Generation Z is like a tailwind. It's like driving sales. They're already accounting for over 10% of sales, and it's only a handful of years of age, like 21, 22, 23-year olds that are legal in that cohort of Generation Z, and they're aging in every day. So this stuff is fascinating, and I think looking at the data and watching this is kind of what keeps me going every day.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, it would be awesome if everybody would just use a uniform method to catalog everything. But then again, making
Yeah.
it difficult actually probably puts you guys at an advantage because you've already been through the gamut and know how to categorize it. So it kind of separates you from everybody. But yeah, that's pretty intense stuff. I mean, as legalization happens and as like these big players start popping out, I'm sure this data is going to be more and more valuable. Now, is that kind of the long-term play is to become like a Nielsen, or is it more of like either being, swallowed up by Nielsen or partnering with the Nielsen to be, more mainstream?
Yeah, great question. So Nielsen is actually one of our investors.
Okay.
So they invested in Headset a couple years back. They were really driven by their client base, which is the traditional consumer packaged good client, beverage alcohol client that were coming to them for their data needs and saying, hey, I'm in California and my wine sales are down. How much of that is due to this emerging cannabis industry where it's legal for someone that's 21 and older to purchase cannabis or purchase wine, and maybe they only have so much purchasing power, share of wallet as they call it. And so Nielsen couldn't answer those questions, and so they looked at the industry, and they looked at any kind of organization that provides data, and they really liked our model and our approach and the real-time aspect of our market measurement. So they chose us. Now, when I think about, that question, like long-term legalizations on the horizon, what does that mean for us? Certainly that would be an outcome that would make sense, being acquired by, a large market intelligence firm. But we do a lot of things different than Nielsen as well. Nielsen is, kind of a traditional market research firm. They've been around almost 100 years at this point, and I think the business that they've built, I mean, it's a massive scale and just incredible what they've done over the decades. Um, but they're not, we think of ourselves in technology first, kind of a software as a service company. And we're really about taking the analytics and turning them into actions for our customers. That means a lot of tools and services. Like I kind of mentioned, reordering for retailers. Like that's a great example of a analytics action. So we have like a very nice reorder report that basically they can plug in some numbers and it spits out, here's what you want to do. So we want to invest more in that, and we'll continue to push into the services business. And so that starts to kind of move away from Nielsen into other types of service providers, that are maybe more even traditional tech service providers that might be out there long term. That could be opportunities for us as well. So I don't know, where we go, but we are venture backed, and being venture backed, that is usually kind of the outcome. You have some sort of exit, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's through M&A, someone purchases you, or maybe you go public at some point. I know that's very popular in this industry, with prior on the different exchanges. Just a couple of years ago, it was very popular. Now with SPACs, very popular path. It's still a little early for us, I feel. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like we're just getting started, just like the industry, I feel like it's just getting started. It's funny to say that, but when you have markets like New York legalizing adult use, granted they've had medical for some time, a relatively limited medical market, and adult use is pretty exciting, and then you've got Mexico right on the horizon. International opportunities as well. So there's a lot of room for us to grow before we have kind of an exit. But you never know with something like federal legalization.
Hmm.
Kind of changing the dynamic quickly. You're going to see operators like Nielsen really get pretty serious about the opportunity. You started to see it in Canada with federal legalization there. It started to happen and starting. You start some more mainstream companies getting involved. But I think when the U.S. goes, I mean, the U.S. is 10 times the size of Canada. And when you think about the U.S. and you think about international, I think a lot of it, you know, we're kind of the first, out there. And once we make this change, I think you're going to see a lot of dominoes fall over after that internationally as well. And so I think we'll see even more momentum from like a traditional tech or traditional organizations wanting to come in, wanting to do M&A, or even get involved directly. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously, you guys help cannabis businesses like all of the startups, dispensaries. I mean, this information is super important. But what I'm getting is that in the long term, the value of kind of your data may be actually in companies that are not cannabis. It's like, how is cannabis affecting the sales of this? Because at that point, you're not one vertical. You're basically every vertical who's affected by cannabis consumption. Is that kind of the long term like vision, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of classify it as endemic versus
Mhm.
non-endemic, and endemic being the product manufacturers, license holders, people that are operating in the framework of legal markets today. Definitely need our data, right? The brands, they're competing day to day, trying to keep that shelf space, trying to be that number one selling product, and very invested. And then the non-endemic clients, what's so compelling there is that it is a wide audience. You've got the CPG companies, you've got financial services companies like banks and hedge funds that are looking at the category, making investments, and really wanting to know, what's the dynamic, in the space. There's a lot of publicly traded companies, and we report on those publicly traded companies. So we've got a number of clients that purchase our data to be able to better understand, how those companies are positioned versus others. Um, it goes on and on. What's so cool about cannabis is that it's not, I use the beverage alcohol kind of analogy. It's pretty good, but it's not complete. There's a lot of other areas of the industry that it touches on. I mean, when you think about like health and beauty, or wellness, topicals and capsules and these types of cannabis formats that touch on wellness that might not be a more of a recreational consumer like you'd get with a beverage alcohol analogy. So it's very, very broad, and there's a lot of people that want to know what's going on. And I really excited to see, what it looks like with federal legalization when things open up,
Right.
and organizations say, now what is this? Everyone knows it's out there, and everyone knows that it's a fast growing industry, with 20-30% compound annual growth rate, in aggregate, and much faster in a lot of different markets. Different markets are growing at different rates. But still, when you look in aggregate, I mean, there's hardly industries out there that grow that quickly. And so the demand for data is going to be quite significant, and we feel like we're well positioned for that, and it's a nice place to be in, just for what the future may hold.
Yeah, I think you guys are positioned perfect for something big to happen for sure. Before I let you go, since you have all the data, what do you kind of see in the foreseeable future in cannabis? What's kind of the trends?
Yeah, it's so many. I think we're going to see, flower command still the largest majority of sales. It's the form factor everyone's most familiar with, I would say. But I think, as a new consumer is coming into the category, we see trends. And I know I keep talking about Generation Z, but it's just so fascinating because it's so new. Think about this audience. They they were born into a world where there's been legal cannabis. If they were born in California, for example, medical was around when they were born, right? So they don't know a world where it's been, illegal at the state level. Eventually, we'll have people that won't remember a world where it's been illegal at the federal level. But it's very fascinating to see, and I think that they're coming in. They're turning 21. They're able to go to the store. They're getting access to all sorts of these different categories. It's not just what you can get. And in the past, it used to be just flour. But now you can get things like vapor pens and beverages and edibles, and so I think you're going to see more and more market share go to these other categories. We already see it with vapor pen. Vapor pen is growing pretty well, and it really resonates with the younger consumer. There's a convenience factor. They've just been acclimated to that, where maybe an older generation would gravitate more towards flower, pre-roll, younger seems to gravitate towards vapor pen. It's still a little expensive, although that's changing. We're seeing some new products being introduced in markets like California that are actually quite inexpensive, surprisingly inexpensive. And so I think you're going to see pricing come down. That will further drive more interest in those categories. I think that's, one thing, and I think more brands within the category. There's like the beverage category gets a lot of attention right now. We recently published a report on beverage that's available on our website, at no cost, a high level kind of, analysis of the market. And there's really not that many brands producing beverages today. And it's a relatively small percentage of sales, 1% to 2%, depending on kind of the market you're looking at. But a lot of that's driven by just access. There's just not that many brands producing it. And you're starting to see some pretty interesting dynamics. I recently wrote about Cann beverages, CANN. They're out of California. They come in, 2.5 milligram package size per can. And, they're all about social, the social experience. You can have 1 to 2 cans, and you won't kind of want to lay down on the couch, like, which is so common with, high potency edible or high potency beverage. When you have, 100 milligram in one bottle, you got to be really careful depending on your tolerance. But myself, I have to be really careful, can only have a little bit, right? Because it could be way too much. So you have Cann that's positioned, quite differently. And they've got investors like Gwyneth Paltrow, that have come in, that are talking about this. So you're going to see this start to open up, different consumption patterns. Like, people are going to consume it more socially. You're going to go to a barbecue and someone's going to bring a 6-pack of White Claw and a 6-pack of Cann, and that's going to kind of drive more interest there and better sales. And you're going to see more brands come in and try and capture some of that opportunity and develop. And you're going to see those categories continue to grow. So I think, that's something to watch. I don't think the book has been written quite yet. I think that there are a lot of brands that are out there that have been there for a long time and may very well be the winners long term. But I think there's plenty of opportunity. And I like to joke, that there's never been a better time to jump into the cannabis space, no matter what you're in. If you're in tech and ancillary services like us, or you're in, product manufacturing or what have you, it's like always gets better, and the opportunity gets bigger. And so it's not where it's, really challenging. I think if you were to introduce a alcoholic seltzer, I think you might have a hard time, taking away market share from someone like White Claw or Truly. I really, be harder. But in cannabis, it's wide open. And especially with federal legalization, whatever form it takes on the horizon, I think it's only going to get bigger and bigger.
Those are some great insights. So I guess for all the startups and, the dispensaries and the different companies and brands out there that want to get some of this data, what's the easiest way to kind of get started with Headset?
Yeah, thanks. You can find us online. We're at headset.io. That's our website. You can sign up for what we call Headset Insights Pulse. It's our free version of our market data. So it's no cost. You can get access to kind of category level trends across the different markets that we're in. So great, high level insight if you just want to know, how a beverage is doing month over month, for example. That's all freely available. We also have some industry reports, like I mentioned, the beverage report we wrote. We do those about once a month. We make those freely available as well. So all different angles. We did another recent one on demographics that's quite interesting, like who is consuming this cannabis, what's driving them to consume, and purchase in legal markets. So industry reports are available. And then we have a whole host of other services as well. So that's all at Headset.io. And you can also follow some of my writing. I try and write about once a week on just kind of the overlap between consumer packaged goods and cannabis. And you're right, I call it cannabis packaged goods. And that's all on Medium. So if you just search cannabis packaged goods on Medium, I cover different organizations, talked a lot about Cann and the GTI deal. So Green Thumb did a partnership there, Curaleaf and some other, large organizations, and just kind of some of their strategy and their type of product lines. And I find it, pretty interesting to write. So hopefully, people find it interesting to read. So I encourage you to take a look there as well.
Yeah, I checked it out. I could vouch for it. It's very interesting stuff.
Thanks,
Sai, thanks for coming on the show. It'll be interesting to see how many beverage cannabis startups are a result of this show. But we look forward to talking to you guys again, and much of luck to everything that you're doing. Once again, I want to thank Sai Scott with Headset for coming on to the show. And for all your cannabis news and other podcasts like this one, go visit www.trichomes.com, or you can also download the Trichomes community app. If you want to reach out to the show, email us at techandcannabis@trichomes.com. I'm Jason Kitamura, and thanks for joining us.